You're simply not leadership material, Rachel. Maybe in a few more years. Sandra's words echoed in the boardroom as I watched my promotion slip away to her nephew, a kid fresh out of college who couldn't tell a balance sheet from a bedsheet. My name is Rachel Thompson. I'm 34 years old, and I've been a senior financial analyst at Morrison Holdings in downtown Chicago for 8 years. What Sandra Whitmore didn't know as she smiled smugly across that mahogany table was that her own husband had been quietly documenting her embezzlement for months, and he was about to hand me the keys to her destruction. I simply nodded and thanked her for the feedback. But something fundamental shifted inside me that Tuesday afternoon at 3:47 p.m. After 8 years of 60-hour weeks, after saving the company $2.3 million through my process optimization initiatives, after being the go-to person for every financial crisis, I was being passed over for a 22-year-old whose only qualification was sharing Sandra's DNA. I appreciate the consideration, I said calmly, gathering my presentation materials. I'll keep working hard. Sandra's satisfied smirk told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about my qualifications. This was personal. I'd started at Morrison Holdings straight out of graduate school with my MBA from Northwestern. The company specialized in mid-market acquisitions, and I'd worked my way up from junior analyst to senior financial analyst, handling due diligence on deals worth hundreds of millions. My track record was spotless. I'd never missed a deadline, never made a calculation error that wasn't caught and corrected within hours, and my financial models had become the template the entire department used. Sandra Whitmore had been my director for 3 years, ever since she married William Whitmore, and suddenly found herself fast-tracked into upper management. William sat on Morrison Holdings' board of directors and owned a 15% stake in the company, a detail that explained Sandra's meteoric rise from marketing coordinator to director of financial operations in just 18 months. I'd always been professional with Sandra, even when her decisions made no financial sense. Like when she insisted we pursue the Hartfield Industries acquisition despite my analysis showing it would result in a $8.7 million loss over 2 years. Or when she killed the Meridian Tech deal that I'd proven would generate $12.4 million in profit within the first year alone. You need to think bigger picture, Rachel, she'd say dismissively. Numbers aren't everything. This from a woman who got her MBA online and whose previous finance experience consisted of balancing her sorority's petty cash fund. The vice president of financial operations position had opened up when Marcus Chen left for Goldman Sachs. It was the natural next step in my career progression, and everyone in the department assumed it was mine. I'd been acting VP for 6 months already, handling all the strategic planning and presenting directly to the board. I'd spent 3 weeks preparing my presentation, complete with a 5-year strategic plan that would increase departmental efficiency by 34% while reducing costs by $4.2 million annually. The projections were conservative, the implementation timeline realistic, and the ROI calculations were bulletproof. But when I walked into that boardroom, I could see from Sandra's expression that the decision had already been made. "Rachel, I'd like you to meet Tyler Brennan," Sandra said, gesturing to the young man sitting beside her. "He'll be joining us as Vice President of Financial Operations." Tyler looked like he was still borrowing his father's suits. His handshake was limp, his smile nervous, and when I asked him about his experience with leveraged buyouts, he actually asked me what LBO stood for. "Tyler brings fresh perspectives," Sandra explained to the board. "Sometimes experience can make us too rigid in our thinking." William Whitmore, Sandra's husband, sat quietly at the far end of the table. He didn't speak during the meeting, but I noticed he was taking detailed notes. At the time, I assumed he was documenting Tyler's qualifications for HR purposes. I was wrong. He was documenting something else entirely. That evening, I sat in my Lincoln Park apartment reviewing every decision Sandra had made since becoming my supervisor. What I'd initially attributed to incompetence began forming a different pattern entirely. The Hartfield Industries deal she'd pushed despite my objections? Hartfield was owned by her brother-in-law, Marcus Brennan, the same Marcus Brennan who turned out to be Tyler's father. The Meridian Tech deal she'd killed? I pulled up the files and discovered that Meridian's CEO, Jonathan Hayes, had been in acquisition talks with Brennan Industries just 2 months after our deal fell through. They'd sold for $34 million, almost exactly what Morrison Holdings would have paid, but with Brennan Industries taking the profits instead of us. I started a spreadsheet. Column A, deal name. Column B, Sandra's recommendation. Column C, actual outcome. Column D, who benefited. By 2:30 a.m., I had documented 17 transactions over 2 years where Sandra's decisions had redirected potential profits away from Morrison Holdings and toward companies with connections to the Brennan family network. But I needed more than spreadsheets. I needed proof. The next morning, I arrived at the office at 6:15 a.m. as usual. What wasn't usual was finding William Whitmore sitting in the lobby with 2 cups of coffee. "Ms. Thompson, could I have a word?" William was in his early 50s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed. He had the quiet confidence that came from 20 years of successful investments and board positions. More importantly, he had access to information I couldn't get on my own. We walked to a small conference room on the executive floor. "I owe you an apology," he began. "Yesterday's decision wasn't based on merit, and we both know it." I remained silent. In my experience, when powerful people start conversations with apologies, the best strategy is to listen. "I've been watching Sandra's decisions for the past 18 months, he continued. "Initially, I thought she was just adjusting to the role. Financial operations can be complex, and everyone makes mistakes early on." He slid a manila folder across the table. "But mistakes don't follow patterns. Corruption does." Inside the folder were bank records, email printouts, and what appeared to be surveillance photos of Sandra meeting with Marcus Brennan at various restaurants around Chicago. "She's been systematically steering deals toward companies that pay her consulting fees," William explained. "The Hartfield deal alone netted her $340,000 in advisory services, paid through a shell company called Whitmore Consulting that she established without my knowledge, using my name." I studied the documents. The evidence was overwhelming, but something didn't add up. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. "She's your wife." William's expression hardened. "She's my wife, but she's also destroying a company I've invested 20 years of my life in building, and she's using my name to do it." He leaned forward. "I need someone inside the operations to help me document everything properly. Someone who understands the financial implications and can build a case that will hold up in court." "What's in it for me?" "Justice, and the VP position you should have had from the beginning." I closed the folder and looked directly at him. "What do you need me to do?" Over the next 6 weeks, I became Sandra's perfect employee. I arrived early, stayed late, and never questioned her decisions. When she asked me to prepare financial projections for potential acquisitions, I complied immediately. When she requested detailed analyses of our competitors' portfolios, I delivered comprehensive reports within 24 hours. What Sandra didn't realize was that every document she asked me to prepare was also being copied to a secure folder that William and I had established. Every email she sent through the company system was being backed up to an external server. Every meeting she took in her office was being recorded through the security system that William, as a board member, had legal access to monitor. The picture that emerged was even worse than we'd initially suspected. Sandra wasn't just steering deals toward Brennan-connected companies. She was actively sabotaging Morrison Holdings' competitive position by sharing our bidding strategies, our financial models, and our target company analyses with Marcus Brennan in advance of every major acquisition. The Burlington manufacturing deal that had slipped away from us in March? Marcus Brennan had received a copy of our entire due diligence report 3 days before the auction. The Coastal Logistics acquisition that we'd lost to Brennan Industries in May? Sandra had forwarded them our financial projections, allowing them to bid exactly $1.2 million above our maximum offer. According to my calculations, Sandra's corporate espionage had cost Morrison Holdings $47.8 million in lost opportunities over 18 months. But we needed to catch her in the act. The opportunity came in September when Morrison Holdings identified Pinnacle Systems as a potential acquisition. Target. Pinnacle was a software company with $23 million in annual revenue and significant growth potential in the healthcare sector. William suggested we use Pinnacle as our trap. I prepared 2 versions of our acquisition analysis. The first version, the one that went into Sandra's official files, recommended a maximum bid of $31 million based on conservative growth projections. The second version, the one that William and I knew represented Pinnacle's true value, justified a bid up to $48 million based on their proprietary software's market potential. Then we waited. On October 12th at 11:23 a.m., Sandra called me into her office. "Rachel, I need you to prepare a comprehensive analysis of the Pinnacle opportunity for the board presentation next week. I want every detail. Financial projections, market analysis, competitive positioning, everything." "Of course," I replied. "What's our timeline?" "I need it by Thursday." "And Rachel?" She leaned back in her chair with that familiar smirk. "Make sure the projections are conservative. We don't want to overpay for this one." I spent the next 3 days preparing the most detailed acquisition analysis of my career. Every number was meticulously researched, every projection was backed by market data, and every recommendation was supported by rigorous financial modeling. On Thursday morning, I delivered a report that recommended Morrison Holdings bid no more than $31 million for Pinnacle Systems. On Thursday evening at 6:47 p.m., our surveillance system recorded Sandra photographing every page of my report with her personal cell phone. On Friday morning at 8:15 a.m., Marcus Brennan's assistant called Pinnacle Systems to schedule an urgent meeting about a potential acquisition. "We've got her," William said when he called me that afternoon. But we weren't finished yet. The acquisition committee meeting was scheduled for October 23rd at 2:00 p.m. All 7 board members would be present, along with Sandra, myself, and Tyler Brennan, who still hadn't figured out what LBO stood for despite being VP for 3 months. That morning, William provided me with one final piece of evidence: bank records showing that $127,000 had been transferred from Brennan Industries to Whitmore Consulting on October 18th, 6 days after Sandra had photographed my Pinnacle report. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. I arrived at the boardroom at 1:45 p.m. with my presentation materials and a backup folder containing every piece of evidence William and I had collected over the past 2 months. Sandra was already there, looking confident and relaxed. She'd worn her lucky red suit, the same one she'd worn when she'd killed the Meridian Tech deal and when she'd recommended the disastrous Hartfield acquisition. "Ready to make your case, Rachel?" she asked with mock encouragement. "I'm curious to see if your projections align with market realities." The way she emphasized market realities told me everything I needed to know. She already knew what Brennan Industries was planning to bid for Pinnacle. At precisely 2:00 p.m., Chairman Robert Morrison called the meeting to order. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to discuss the potential acquisition of Pinnacle Systems. Rachel, you've prepared our analysis?" I stood up and began my presentation. For 20 minutes, I walked through Pinnacle's financials, market position, and growth potential. I presented my conservative projections and recommended a maximum bid of $31 million. Sandra nodded approvingly throughout my presentation. "Excellent work, Rachel," she said when I finished. "I think $31 million represents the absolute maximum we should consider for this opportunity." William raised his hand. "Sandra, before we finalize our bidding strategy, I'd like to share some information that's come to my attention." Sandra's confident expression flickered slightly. "What kind of information?" "The kind that explains why Morrison Holdings has been losing acquisition opportunities to the same competitor for the past 18 months. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. William stood up and walked to the projection screen. "What I'm about to show you represents the most systematic case of corporate fraud I've encountered in 20 years of business." The first slide was a timeline of every major acquisition Morrison Holdings had pursued since Sandra became Director of Financial Operations. The second slide showed how many of those deals had ultimately gone to companies connected to Marcus Brennan. The third slide was a photograph of Sandra's phone screen, Clearly showing her photographing my pinnacle analysis, Sandra's face went white. "William, what is this? What are you doing?" "I'm doing what I should have done 18 months ago," William replied calmly. "I'm protecting this company from corporate sabotage." "What?" Sandra said next, surprised everyone in the room, including me. "You don't understand," she said desperately. "Marcus promised me that if I helped him for 2 years, he'd make me a partner in Brennan Industries. I was going to leave Morrison Holdings anyway. I was doing William a favor by positioning him to take over my role." The silence in the boardroom was deafening. "You were doing me a favor?" William's voice was barely above a whisper. "By stealing from the company I've spent 20 years building? By using my name on a consulting company I never authorized? By making me an unwitting accomplice to corporate espionage?" Tyler Brennan suddenly looked like he was going to be sick. "Aunt Sandra, you said the job was legitimate. You said I was qualified." "You are qualified," Sandra snapped. "These people just don't appreciate fresh thinking." Robert Morrison cleared his throat. "Sandra, you're terminated immediately. Security will escort you from the building. And you're banned from company property pending criminal charges." Sandra stood up abruptly, knocking over her chair. "You can't do this to me! I have rights! I have a contract!" William slid another document across the table. "Your contract includes a morality clause that voids all compensation and benefits in cases of fraud or corporate espionage. You won't be receiving severance and will be seeking restitution for the $47.8 million in losses your actions caused." Sandra stared at the document, then looked around the room at 7 board members who were no longer making eye contact with her. "This is all her fault," she said, pointing at me. "She's been plotting against me since the day I was promoted. This is a setup." "Sandra," I said calmly, "you photographed confidential documents with your personal phone and sold them to a competitor. Nobody set you up. You set yourself up." Security arrived at that moment. As they escorted Sandra from the boardroom, she turned back one final time. "You think you've won?" she called out. "Marcus will destroy this company. He knows all your strategies, all your targets. You're finished." The door closed behind her with a soft click. The criminal investigation took 4 months. Sandra was ultimately charged with corporate espionage, fraud, and money laundering. The evidence William and I had collected was so comprehensive that her legal team advised her to accept a plea deal rather than go to trial. She received 3 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay $2.1 million in restitution. Marcus Brennan was charged as a co-conspirator. His company was banned from participating in acquisitions in our sector for 5 years, and he paid a $4.7 million fine to settle civil charges. Tyler Brennan, surprisingly, turned out to be completely innocent. He genuinely believed his aunt had recommended him based on merit. When the truth came out, he resigned immediately and enrolled in a financial analysis certification program. Last I heard, he was working as a junior analyst at a small firm in Milwaukee and doing quite well. The Pinnacle Systems acquisition? We ended up buying the company for $34 million, well below our actual maximum bid, because the scandal surrounding Brennan Industries had eliminated our primary competitor from the auction. 3 days after Sandra's arrest, Robert Morrison called me into his office. "Rachel, I believe we have a vice president position that needs to be filled." The offer was everything I'd worked toward for 8 years. $167,000 base salary, equity participation, and leadership of a department that had grown to 12 analysts under my strategic plan. But more than the money or the title, I'd gained something invaluable: the respect of my colleagues and the knowledge that competence and integrity eventually win over manipulation and fraud. As I write this, Morrison Holdings has completed 4 major acquisitions using the financial models and due diligence processes I've implemented. Our success rate has improved by 340% compared to Sandra's tenure, and we've generated $23.7 million in profits that would have been lost under the previous leadership. William Whitmore and I maintain a professional relationship built on mutual respect. He's remarried, a patent attorney named Patricia who shares his passion for sailing and has no interest in corporate acquisitions. Sandra was released from federal prison last month. According to mutual acquaintances, she's working as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm in Peoria and living in a studio apartment above a dry cleaner. Sometimes justice takes its time. Sometimes it needs a little help from people who understand that documentation beats manipulation, patience beats impulse, and competence beats connections. But it always, eventually wins. The most satisfying part wasn't Sandra's conviction or my promotion, or even the company's financial success. The most satisfying part was the moment in that boardroom when everyone realized that the quiet analyst they'd overlooked for years had been systematically building a case that would change everything. Sandra had been so focused on her schemes with Marcus Brennan that she'd never bothered to consider what William might be thinking. She'd assumed that marriage meant blind loyalty, that authority meant unquestioned support, and that her victims would remain victims forever. She was wrong on all counts. The lesson here isn't about revenge, it's about justice. When someone uses their position to cheat, steal, and sabotage, they're not just hurting their immediate victims. They're undermining the principle that merit should matter, that hard work should be rewarded, and that integrity should count for something in the business world. Sometimes the system works exactly as it should. Sometimes the right people are watching, gathering evidence, and waiting for the perfect moment to act. And sometimes, the quiet financial analyst who everyone underestimates turns out to be the one who brings down the entire house of cards. Karma doesn't always need assistance, but when it does, it helps to have someone who knows how to read a balance sheet, build a spreadsheet, and document everything in triplicate. Sandra learned that lesson the hard way. I hope Tyler remembers it as he builds his own career. As for me, I've got 17 new analysts to train and 5 major acquisitions to evaluate this quarter. It's good to be the vice president,